An Idiot's Guide to the Federal Reserve Scam by Quentin Figueroa. What is the Federal Reserve? The Federal Reserve, or Fed, is a privately owned central bank that controls the money supply of the United States. All the dollars we have in existence today were created by the Federal Reserve. In fact, if you look at any piece of currency, you will see that it says Federal Reserve note on it. You might not know it, but the Fed is privately owned. The Fed is a for-profit business that is owned by European and American banking families. These families loan money to the United States and make money off of the interest. The Fed is publicly subsidized. The Fed encourages banks to take huge risks because they know that any losses they might incur are picked up by the American taxpayer. The Fed makes money through the IRS. When we send money to the IRS, they take that money and turn it over to the Treasury, who in turn pays interest on bonds to the Fed. Short story, our taxes are paid to the Fed. The Fed makes people poorer. Through inflation, the Fed makes people poorer and makes the owners richer. Because of the Fed, common items like food and gas become more expensive. The Fed loans money out of thin air. The Fed doesn't just print money out of thin air, it loans it out of thin air. All the money we currently have in circulation is a loan from the Fed to you, with interest. The Fed indebts us in the future. The Fed spends wealth that we have now and then flips us the bill years into the future. By doing this, we are making us poorer and poorer in the future. The Fed operates in secrecy. The Fed has no government oversight and operates behind closed doors. The Federal Reserve has never been audited. The Fed gives money to banks for free. Banks are legally able to lend money that they don't have. The Fed allows banks to create loans for people with money that banks don't have. The Fed creates booms and busts. By controlling interest rates and the money supply, the Fed is able to create booms and busts in the economy. Quote, "The Federal Reserve is not American, not federal, has no reserves, and is not a bank. It is controlled by some of the richest and politically influential families in the world. It has the power to create money out of thin air. Institutions like the Federal Reserve have been staunchly opposed by designers of the Constitution and by presidents such as George Washington and Thomas Jefferson." End quote. Robert Kiyosaki, Conspiracy of the Rich. Why do we have it? There are two answers as to why we have the Fed. There is a general mainstream answer, then there is a hidden real answer. Quote, "The Fed, as the Federal Reserve is known, was originally given the mission of establishing an elastic money supply. The idea would be that the Fed could expand or contract the amount of money in circulation to correspond with economic activity. It was thought that such movements could hold prices steady through good times and bad. Even if such a mission were a good idea to begin with, it's easy to see that the Fed has utterly failed in accomplishing it. Over the past 100 years, the dollar has lost more than 95% of its value. So much for price stability. The truth is that the Fed now exists for the sole purpose of providing the inflation necessary to allow the government to spend more than it collects in taxes." End quote. Peter Schiff, How an Economy Grows and Why It Crashes. The cover story. We have the Fed to stabilize the economy. We are told that the Fed helps to stabilize the economy. We are told that we need the Fed to do the tricky task of determining interest rates and the money supply. If it wasn't for the Fed, the overall economy wouldn't operate at maximum efficiency and the free market would run rampant. The real story, the Fed is to destabilize the economy. In reality, the Fed was created to and continues to destabilize the economy. Why would the owners and controllers of the Fed want to do this? because the goal is to bring control of the United States into the hands of the bankers behind the Fed. The U.S., with its roots in freedom and free markets, is a very hard nation to control. Taking over financial control of a nation is one of the best ways to control a nation. This has been done time and time again in many other nations. The cover story. We have the Fed to control interest rates and credit. We are told that the Fed is needed to manage the complex and necessary task of controlling interest rates and managing credit. By having the Fed control interest rates, we are able to avoid the boom and bust cycles that are a natural occurrence of unmanaged markets. If it wasn't for the Fed, we would probably be in a recession right now. The real story. We have the Fed to keep real interest rates and credit from being achieved. In reality, the Fed controls interest rates and credit to artificially create booms and busts. By creating artificial booms, the Fed is able to loan trillions of dollars to the United States and the people. By creating artificial busts, the Fed is able to buy up many assets such as businesses and real estate through the federal government. The cover story. We have the Fed to eliminate the business cycle. We are told the Fed helps to eliminate the business cycle by carefully managing the money supply and ensuring that all the necessary markets are balanced and working correctly. After all, having a business cycle is a bad thing because anything that naturally occurs in business is a bad thing, and natural things should be turned into unnatural things by the Fed. The real story. We have the Fed to create the business cycle. In reality, the Fed creates the business cycle and keeps markets from reaching equilibrium. There is no such thing as a business cycle in a free market. The market decides what is needed and what isn't needed. It isn't possible for the Fed to centrally manage a business cycle. All they can do is take whatever balance the free market already has and distort it further. The cover story. We're told we have the Fed to eliminate bank runs. We're told that the Fed helps to eliminate bank runs. If it wasn't for the Fed doing their advanced economic stuff and their complex mathematical theories, we would have bank runs left and right. Banks are out to get us, and if we don't have the Fed, we better watch out. The real story is we have the Fed to create bank runs. The problem is that the major bank runs we have had historically are because of Fed manipulation. The bank runs of the crash of 1929 were a direct result of Fed manipulation in the markets. If it wasn't for the Fed, there would have never been a crash to begin with, and there would have never been bank runs as a result of the crash. The cover story is we are told that we have the Fed to control inflation. We are told that the Fed carefully helps to monitor inflation. We are told that a small amount of inflation is good each year. We want to have inflation so that we can keep the people spending and the economy going. The Fed monitors closely the amount of inflation and knows which rates to use in order to keep inflation going at a steady rate. These people are so smart. The real story, we have the Fed to create inflation. In reality, the Fed has to create more and more inflation because our money is debt. And the interest on our debt-based money can only be paid off with more debt-based money. And so more and more money has to continue being loaned out, and as a result, more and more inflation is the inevitable outcome. A main goal of the Fed is to extract our wealth through inflation. The cover story is we have the Fed to stabilize banking. We are told that before the Fed, many banks would issue their own notes, and there was lots of disparity between the value of the money from one bank to another. As we know, without any Fed oversight, those banks will go crazy and screw people over. The Fed needs to force banks how to operate because people aren't smart enough to choose good banks on their own. The real story is we have the Fed to destabilize banking. In reality, the Fed destabilizes banks by forcing them what to do rather than allowing them to operate the way they want to. By allowing banks to do what they want, they will naturally work out all the problems and find the most efficient methods to keep things stable. But instead, the Fed forces their bad ideas on banks. The cover story, we're told that we have the Fed to create employment. We're told that the Fed is able to create employment by allocating resources where they are most needed for jobs. If you're not understanding it by now, let me write it out for you in plain English. You are a moron, and the Fed is full of super smart government employees who are masters of doing complicated things that ordinary people like you and me can't figure out. they got this employment thing under control. The real story is we have the Fed to create unemployment. You can't print employment into existence. By forcing jobs through money lending, all you're doing is making everyone as a whole poorer. Furthermore, taking money from where it is needed and moving it to where it isn't needed is a misallocation of resources and another net loss. Unemployment isn't fixed by the Fed. It is further sustained by it. History and timeline. To better understand the Federal Reserve, it is important to understand that the creation of a central bank has long been the plan from international bankers. After many failed attempts, it wasn't until 1913 that the bankers finally accomplished their goal. Quote, "Give me control of a nation's money, and I care not who makes her laws." End quote. Mayer Amschel Rothschild. 1694. The Bank of England established. The Bank of England was one of the first central banks and served as a model for how the Federal Reserve would operate. Throughout the history of America, the same families who controlled Britain through the Bank of England worked to control America the exact same way. 1757. Colonial scrip issued in colonies. One of the earlier currencies issued in the colonies was the debt-free colonial scrip. During the issuance of this currency, no taxes were necessary and the economy ran relatively smooth. 1763. Rothschild banking dynasty established. Mayer Amschel Rothschild establishes one of the largest banking dynasties ever. The Rothschilds went on to become the prominent banking family of the 19th century. It has been said that, quote, "the wealth of Rothschild consists of the bankruptcy of nations," end quote. 1764. British Currency Act forbids American colonies from issuing currency. After seeing the success of the colonial scrip, Britain decided to issue the Currency Act in 1764, which forbid the colonies from issuing their own money. 1775 to 1783, American Revolution. One of the main causes leading up to the American Revolution, contrary to popular belief, was the control Britain had over the money supply of the colonies. America was founded by protesting control over the money by foreign hands. 1791 to 1811. Hamilton convinces Washington on the first bank of the United States. Washington, not being the best economist, was persuaded by Hamilton to issue the first central bank in the U.S. Almost immediately after the creation of the U.S., international bankers were already working their way in. 1798 to 1815. 5 Rothschild sons spread out across Europe. Each of the 5 sons spread out to establish banks in the following European cities: London, Paris, Vienna, Naples, and Frankfurt. 1811. The Bank of the United States charter runs out. After 20 years, the first bank of the U.S. charter runs out and it comes to an end. 1812. War of 1812. The War of 1812 is primarily fought because the U.S. failed to renew the charter for the first Bank of the United States. 1815. Nathan Rothschild takes over financial control of Britain. After the Battle of Waterloo, Nathan Rothschild was able to buy up a large portion of the Bank of England and establish the Rothschild family as major players behind world financial control. 1816. Second Bank of U.S. established. 5 years after the end of the first Bank of the U.S. charter, a second one is started once again. 1832 to 1835. Biddle versus Jackson on bank. Towards the end of the second Bank of the U.S. charter, the powerful banker Nicholas Biddle uses every financial trick in his book to keep Andrew Jackson from putting an end to the bank. Eventually, Andrew Jackson comes out victorious and is able to put an end to the Second National Bank of the U.S. 1835. National debt paid off. Shortly after Jackson stops the Second National Bank, the U.S. national debt is paid off for the first time and only time in its history. 1835. Jackson assassination attempt. An assassination is attempted on Andrew Jackson. It's fairly obvious to understand why. 1854. Rise of Morgan. Junius S. Morgan, J.P. Morgan's father, joins forces with London-based George Peabody and Company to establish the House of Morgan banking establishment. His son, J.P. Morgan, a frontman for the Rothschilds, goes on to finance many industries in America and becomes one of the largest American bankers of the late 1800s. 1861 to 1865, American Civil War. Once again, the world financiers set up another war to try to divide America and take over financial control. A wartime income tax was also used for the first time in America, modeled after a British system of income taxation. 1862 to 1863, Lincoln issues greenbacks. Abe catches on to the bankers' plan to loan America money at 19% interest during the war and issues greenbacks from the Treasury instead. April 15, 1865. Lincoln assassinated. Lincoln is assassinated. Some people say that John Wilkes Booth was a front man used by the international bankers. 1870s to 1900s, rise of Rockefeller. Through the financial efforts of J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller establishes the largest oil company in the world. This vast wealth would eventually solidify a close partnership between the House of Morgan and the House of Rockefeller. The Rockefellers go on to become the 20th century Morgans in America, closely aligned with the Rothschilds, of course. 1880s, rise of Schiff. During this time, Jacob Schiff also becomes a major financier in America. Once again, he is closely linked to the Rothschilds. 1880s to 1900s, Gilded Age. With a good 20 or so years of relatively free markets and no central bank, America experiences one of the largest growth periods ever. July 2nd, 1881. President James Garfield assassinated. President Garfield openly stated that whoever controls the supply of currency would control the business and activities of all the people. President Garfield was shot at a railroad station after only 4 months in office. 1907, Panic of 1907. With all their American players in place, the international bankers engineer another staged panic in order to establish yet another central bank in America. 1910, secret meeting at Jekyll Island. High-level European and American bankers and politicians have a secret meeting at Jekyll Island in order to discuss the details of how the new central bank, the Federal Reserve, will be established. 1912, Woodrow Wilson put into office. Woodrow Wilson is cleverly put into office by the bankers in order to pass many of the bankers' plans. 1913, creation of IRS. The IRS is established and covertly becomes the collection branch for the soon-to-be created Fed. The IRS has an integral relationship with the Fed, as you will see later. 1913, creation of Fed. With the IRS in place, the next version of an American central bank is established. The international bankers played Democrats against Republicans. The Democrats pushed for the Aldrich Plan, the Republicans for the Federal Reserve Act. Both plans were essentially the same thing with different names. With time, the Federal Reserve would be evolved into what we have today. 1914 to 1919, World War I. Once a central bank is established, it's time to go to war and make some money. The currency supply is inflated and dollars are sent to businesses and banks abroad. 1921 to 1930, the Roaring Twenties. With a centrally controlled expansion of the money supply, the 1920s experience a boom. The currency supply is artificially inflated and people are loving the easy money. 1929, stock market crash. Once the expansion of the currency supply in the 1920s comes to a stop, the stock market crash of 1929 takes place. 1933, executive order to turn gold in. In order to keep people away from real wealth and real money, an executive order 6102 is issued in order to collect people's real money in exchange for Fed paper money. 1933, Glass-Steagall Era. As a result of the engineered stock market crash of 1929, new bank regulations were put in place during the Glass-Steagall Era. The government jumped in and insured many of the risks that banks took, and by doing this created a moral hazard that banks were able to use to their advantage. 1934, Great Depression. The Great Depression sets in as a result of Fed manipulation, and America experiences one of its hardest periods. 1935, Social Security. Social Security is created in America wherein United States citizens are covertly pledged as collateral to international bankers for the debt of the United States. 1939 to 1945, World War II. With a central bank that is able to inflate the currency, the surefire way to revive a depressed economy is to just print more money and take the country into war. And that is exactly what happened during World War II. 1951, Treasury Accord. The Treasury Accord was an agreement put in place between the U.S. Treasury and the Fed that assured the Federal Reserve would remain an independent entity. 1963, Kennedy authorizes Treasury to issue money. Like Lincoln 100 years earlier, Kennedy authorizes the Treasury to issue its own money outside of international banker control. 1963, Kennedy assassinated. Like Lincoln, Kennedy is also assassinated. 1971, dollar taken off gold standard. The dollar removes its final connection to real money and at this point becomes 100% paper money backed by nothing. 1971, gold prices soar. Once a dollar is depegged from gold, the price of gold soars. Monetary, 1971, world reserve currency. The US dollar becomes the world reserve currency so that in the future other countries will keep the dollar propped up and going strong. 1980, Monetary Control Act. The Monetary Control Act gave the Federal Reserve even greater control over the banking industry. Banks now had to follow rules put in place by the Fed. 1999, Financial Services Modernization Act. This legislation took note of the problems created by the earlier Glass-Steagall regulations and replaced many of these regulations with even more outrageous regulations, which created even more problems and led in part to the housing bubble of 2008. 2000, dot-com bubble. Leading up to the dot-com bubble, the Federal Reserve pumped lots of currency into the market, which led to malinvestment and artificially raised the prices of stocks, especially tech stocks during this time. 2008, housing bubble. Like the dot-com bubble, the housing bubble was caused by the Fed pumping lots of currency into the market through artificially low interest rates and the government backing risky loans to ineligible home buyers. 2008, crash of 2008. All the easy loans and Fed manipulation had to eventually come to an end, and in 2008 it finally did. But the crash was never allowed to fully take place. The Fed jumped in and essentially bought up all the bad loans and kicked the can further down the road. Present day, government bubble. What we are left with today is an economy built mostly on artificial inflation, completely engineered through the Federal Reserve. Interest rates are artificially kept low to keep the economy running, and the Federal Reserve prints what is needed to make up for all the losses by having these low interest rates. Mathematically speaking, this can't go on forever. Quote, because once they got the Federal Reserve into position, locked into position illegally, but locked into a position of power, then they could put on the dollar annuit coeptis. Our enterprise is now a success, meaning we have now taken over America, and America was sound asleep and didn't even know it. So what I'm saying is that we have all been had. End quote. Jordan Maxwell, Matrix of Power. Who created it and who owns it? The Fed was created back in 1913 by a group of international bankers. The largest European and American bankers of the early 1900s decided to collude with one another and create a state-enforced cartel that would monopolize the banking industry into their hands. Quote, "The most powerful men in the United States were themselves answerable to another power, a foreign power, and a power which had been steadfastly seeking to extend its control over the young Republic of the United States since its very inception. This power was the financial power of England, centered in the London branch of the House of Rothschild. The fact was that in 1910, the United States was for all political purposes being ruled from England, and so it is today. The 10 largest bank holding companies in the United States are firmly in the hands of certain banking houses, all of which have branches in London. They are J.P. Morgan Company, Brown Brothers Harriman, Warburg, Kuhn Loeb, and J. Henry Schroeder. All of them maintain close relationships with the House of Rothschild, principally through the Rothschild control of international money markets through its manipulation of the price of gold." End quote. Eustace Mullins' Secrets of the Federal Reserve. So, past families. During the creation of the Fed, there were many competing families who decided to team up and create a state-monopolized cartel called the Federal Reserve. Some of those families are as follows: the Rothschilds, Warburgs, Morgans, Schiffs, Harrimans, Lazards, Goldman Sachs, Browns, Schroders, Lehmans. Present-day families. Today, many of the families of the past have been consolidated into two main factions operating behind the Federal Reserve. We have the European faction, headed by the Rothschilds, and we have the American faction, headed by the Rockefellers. The European faction is above the American faction. The House of Morgan basically evolved into the House of Rockefeller from my financial perspective. Rothschilds Europe, Rockefellers America. Past banks. N.M. Rothschild and Sons, M.M. Warburg and Co., Morgan Grenfell and Co., Schroders, Lazard, Lehman Brothers, Merrill Lynch, Bear Stearns, Kuhn Loeb, Chemical Bank, J.P. Morgan, Manufacturers Hanover, Bankers Trust, Bank of New York, Morgan Guaranty Trust Company. Present-day banks. Today, many of the banks of the past have either merged or been purchased by larger banks in an effort to consolidate. Quote, "The Warburgs, Kuhn Loebs, Goldman Sachs, Schiffs, and Rothschilds have intermarried into one big happy banking family." End quote. Dean Henderson, Big Oil, and their bankers in the Persian Gulf. Present-day banks. N.M. Rothschild and Sons, Chase, Citibank, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, Deutsche Bank, BNP Paribas, Barclays, Credit Suisse, UBS, Royal Bank of Scotland. Pro tip. If you really want to know who's behind the Fed, simply follow the money. Look who got bailed out in 2009. Citigroup got $2.513 trillion. Morgan Stanley, $2.041 trillion. Merrill Lynch, $1.949 trillion. Bank of America, $1.344 trillion. Barclays PLC, $868 billion. Bear Stearns, $853 billion. Goldman Sachs, $814 billion. Royal Bank of Scotland, $541 billion. J.P. Morgan Chase, $391 billion. Deutsche Bank, $354 billion. UBS, $287 billion. Credit Suisse, 262 billion. Lehman Brothers, 183 billion. Bank of Scotland, 181 billion. BNP Paribas, 175 billion. Wells Fargo, 159 billion. Dexia, 159 billion. Wachovia, 142 billion. Dresdner Bank, 135 billion. Societe Generale, 124 billion. All other borrowers, 2.639 trillion, and the total of 16.1 trillion. So a brief lesson on economics. To really understand the Fed, you first need to understand a few things about economics. Quote, whoever controls the volume of money in any country is absolute master of all industry and commerce. And when you realize that the entire system is very easily controlled, one way or another, by a few powerful men at the top, you will not have to be told how periods of inflation and depression originate. End quote. James Garfield, President of the United States of America. Money. We use money on a daily basis, but do we really know why we use money or where it comes from? Money evolves from bartering. When a society starts out, people barter what they have for what they need and want. Somebody may barter a cow for 1,000 oranges. But as society becomes more advanced and needs are more specific, it becomes hard to barter certain types of goods. What if somebody has a cow to barter but only wants 100 oranges? How do they barter one-tenth of their cow? So money develops as an item to use in place of barter. Rather than barter two goods directly, money is introduced as a medium of exchange to make bartering easier and more useful. Now if somebody wants only 100 oranges, they can first barter their cow for coins, like gold or silver. And then, once they have the coins, they can now barter just one coin for 100 oranges. Rather than trade their cow directly for 100 oranges, they first traded their cow for money, and then they used a fraction of this money to trade for 100 oranges. Properties of money. But not everything works as well as money. If you use ice cream as money, it will melt and go bad. If you use furniture as money, it is cumbersome and hard to exchange. Certain types of goods work well for money, others do not. Here are some properties that are generally desired in money. Portable, durable, divisible, rare, interchangeable, unit of account, and store of value. We have used lots of things for money throughout history, but gold and silver usually end up being money because they have all of these properties more so than anything else. Receipt money. Now, gold and silver are great for money, but they can be a bit cumbersome to transport around all the time. People would much rather carry dollars or credit cards than coins. So banks start to issue paper receipts for gold, and people exchange these receipts instead of the gold itself. So people store gold in their bank, and the bank issues a receipt saying that you own X ounces of gold. At any time, you can return to the bank and hand them your receipt to reclaim your physical gold. This is where it gets interesting, so pay attention. The dollars we hold in our wallets are actually a receipt on money. At least that's what they originally were. So when the US first started minting dollars, you were able to go back to your bank and turn your dollar in for gold. Look at an early dollar bill. It says up here, this certifies that there have been deposited in the Treasury of United States of America. Here you see gold. This certificate is a legal tender in the amount thereof in payment of all debts and dues, public and private. Gold certificate. You see here gold over here, $20 in gold coin payable to the bearer on demand. So this is an earlier $20 bill. But that has changed and you can't do that anymore. Look at one today. So today, Federal Reserve note. So it no longer says this at the top. we have Federal Reserve note, right? There's no mention of gold anywhere. You have $20, but it's not $20 in gold payment payable to the bearer on demand. So all gold parts are removed from the current one, as you can see. Okay. Our money used to be backed by gold. Now it isn't backed by gold. We have what is called fiat money now. Our money isn't backed by anything. So the important property of money called store of value is no longer present in our money. Because our money isn't backed by value, it can't possibly serve as a store of value. And when you have money without a store of value, it is no longer money. It is currency. And that is what we have today. Currency versus money. Now remember, money has all these properties: portable, durable, divisible, rare, interchangeable, unit of account, store of value. Currency, on the other hand, has these properties: portable, durable, divisible, rare, interchangeable, unit of account, but it does not have store of value. This one missing property, store of value, is what creates all the financial problems we have today. Read on to find out how. Inflation and deflation. Inflation and deflation are really simple. When we increase the amount of money in circulation, we have inflation. When we decrease the amount of money in circulation, we have deflation. We have a money supply, which is the total amount of all the money in circulation. If we add more to it, we have inflation. If we take away from it, we have deflation. So here is the money supply. And if we divide it in half, you can see we have deflation. If we multiply it by 2, we have inflation. So if you remove money, deflation. If you add money, inflation. In general, it doesn't matter whether we have inflation or deflation because prices just adjust accordingly. Here are normal prices. So here's this person's salary, here's the cost, and there you go. So this is what he makes. This is how much it costs for the new car. So if we double the money supply and things cost 2 times as much, we also will usually make 2 times as much at our job. So we don't really lose out. So you can see here that if he was to make twice as much, the car would cost twice as much, but it is still the same ratio, right? So he'll make twice as much, the car will cost twice as much, but everything's still the same. There's no difference in the ratio between the salary and the cost. If we have deflation and things cost half as much, we will also usually make half as much at our job. So it works out about the same. So if he was to make less, things would cost less. So the money supply really doesn't matter unless we destroy purchasing power. Purchasing power. The problem comes when we have inflation, but it isn't distributed equally among everyone. If the inflation we had was true inflation, every one of us would have an increase in our money. But when new money is created by the Fed, we don't all have an increase in our money. Only a few commercial banks get the newly created money. So here you can see the Federal Reserve creates new money. It goes here to commercial banks that receive this money, but this money is not created also for people, right? So it is disproportionately distributed. So it's not, you don't have real inflation. It's going to some people, but not to other people. As a result, the new money makes the value of our current money go down because our money has been diluted. This is called a loss in purchasing power. It takes more dollars to buy the same amount of goods. So what this results in is something more like this. So this would be that salary, and this is the cost. Okay, so going back to this picture here. So if this is what the person made originally, they made 4 units of currency, and it cost 2 units to buy this car, right? And then if you were to double it, this is all still relatively the same. So you got 4 and 2, but if you're over here now and you have inflation with a loss in purchasing power, it's 4 that you're making, but it costs 8. So now it's costing you a lot more to get this because your purchasing power has decreased because there's more dollars in circulation, but your salary is not going up because the money is not being distributed equally throughout the system. And we'll kind of go into more detail on this here in a second. You can measure the purchasing power of the dollar by comparing how many dollars it takes to buy other goods like food, cars, oil, and gold. To see the destruction of the purchasing power of the dollar, all you have to do is look at a graph between gold and the dollar over the past 100 years. Keep in mind that the dollar was removed from the gold standard in 1971, which is where gold really starts to take off. So here is a graph. You have two items. You have the money supply here, M2. So this is the amount of money in circulation. It is one of the units, one of the ways to measure the amount of money in circulation, and this is in billions, as you can see. And then you have the price of gold, right? And you can see that the price of gold and the money supply closely follow each other because the two are essentially linked together. First of all, in 1971 it went up, and you can see this 1971 right here is where gold was no longer linked to the dollar. The dollar was no longer backed by gold. So all the way up until here, it was backed by gold, and you can see the gold price didn't really change. There was something that they did here that changed it, but for the most part, it's the same. As soon as that was removed, now the gold price was able to be priced based on what the supply and demand is of the market. You can see it had a quick spike because people wanted to buy it. And what also occurred now is that it was no longer, when the money supply was no longer linked to gold, it was able to expand much quicker. So the money supply would go up, banks would create a lot more money, the Fed would loan lots more money at interest and create lots of money, right? So you have currency coming into existence, and because there's more currency, it makes the price of gold go up because it takes more currency to buy gold. So it's just, you're creating this inflation. So you will see that as more dollars are created, the price of gold goes up and the value of the dollar goes down. So when I say the value of the dollar goes down, what that means is it takes more dollars to purchase an ounce of gold. So this chart right here is showing you how many dollars it takes to buy an ounce of gold. So right here, it's like $21 to buy an ounce of gold, and then you have $35, roughly give or take, to buy an ounce of gold. But then all of a sudden now, over here, you're looking at around $500 to buy an ounce of gold. And over here is as high as $1,000. So what that means is, relative to gold, the value of your dollar is going down. Because if it costs $1 to buy an ounce of gold, that would mean that the dollar is worth a lot. But it costs $1,000 to buy an ounce of gold, which means the value of your dollar has gone down because the price of gold doesn't go up or down. Gold is just a resource. It's like a car. It's just a resource. And the value of that is determined by what people are willing to pay for it or what other currencies are relative to it. And if it costs more currency to buy the gold, then the price of gold isn't changing, the price of the currency is changing. And that means the price of the currency is going down. So that's why you will see that as more dollars are created, the price of gold goes up and the value of the dollar goes down. So yeah, the value of the dollar goes down, like in this example right here. It costs more to buy things because there's more in circulation and they're not getting circulated everywhere. So you're not seeing this type of fair circulation where it's all relative. It's not relative. It's getting stuck and controlled here and it's not going here. And that's why you have this. So anyway, gold isn't going up in value. The dollar is losing value. The dollar is losing purchasing power, and so it takes more dollars to buy gold. Now, banks aren't stupid. They know that the role of the Fed is to create inflation and money for banks. And because of this, banks purposefully take risks knowing that if they lose money, the Fed will bail them out. This is what happened with the housing bubble in 2008. Banks created risky loans knowing that if they went bust, the Fed would be there to bail them out. And that is exactly what has happened. These banks didn't go bankrupt. The Fed created inflation, made you and me poorer, and the banks came out on top. The banks made money from the bad loans the bad loans they wrote, and then they were made whole again from the Fed when the bad loans went bust. Quote, in the absence of the gold standard, there is no way to protect savings from confiscation through inflation. There is no safe store of value. If there were, the government would have to make its holding illegal, as was done in the case of gold. The financial policy of the welfare state requires that there be no way for the owners of wealth to protect themselves. This is the shabby secret of the welfare statist tirades against gold. Deficit spending is simply a scheme for the hidden confiscation of wealth. Gold stands in the way of the insidious process. It stands as a protector of property rights. End quote. Alan Greenspan, Federal Reserve Chairman. And obviously this quote was either before he was a Fed chairman, because he's obviously a very smart man, or it was just something that you don't hear much about, or, he obviously knows what's going on, but you never hear him say something like this when he was in Congress. Anyway, how the Federal Reserve really works. The Fed is one of the most misunderstood and confusing of all branches of government, and rightfully so. It's supposed to be. If people understood how the Fed really worked, it wouldn't exist. Once you understand the process behind the Fed, you can begin to see the fraud and counterfeiting that is taking place right in front of your eyes. Keep in mind that this might seem crazy and like there are wasted steps. It's supposed to look like that. The whole system is built upon smoke and mirrors. Quote, it's a sobering thought that the federal government now could operate, even at its current level of spending, without levying any taxes whatsoever. All it has to do is create the required money through the Federal Reserve System by monetizing its own bonds. In fact, most of the money it now spends is obtained that way. End quote. J. Edward Griffin, The Creature from Jekyll Island. 5 parties involved. So we first need to understand which entities are involved with the Federal Reserve process. There are 5 main entities: the Treasury, banks, the Fed, the government, and the IRS. 4-step process. The Fed can be broken down into 4 main steps. We will give an overview of each step. Keep in mind that the whole process is built around debt and inflation. Quote, this system requires that we go deeper into debt every month than we were the previous month. We have to always borrow more currency into existence than we are extinguishing every single month, or the whole thing starts to collapse. End quote. Mike Maloney. Okay, so we have these 4 steps here: currency creation, government spending, fractional reserve banking, and tax plus interest. So we will start with currency creation. Okay, so here we go. 1, Treasury creates bond. Next, bank buys bond from Treasury. Treasury gets currency from bank in exchange for bond. Fed buys bond from bank. Bank gets new currency from Fed in exchange for bond. And the whole process repeats again and again. Bond, here, currency, bond, currency, and again. You get the idea. Okay, so that is the process here. Treasury creates bond, bank buys bond from Treasury, Treasury gets currency from bank in exchange for bond, Fed buys bond from bank, bank gets new currency from Fed in exchange for bond, and the whole process repeats again and again. Okay, 2, we have government spending. Treasury deposits currency into government. Government spends currency on social programs and efforts. So you got the military, you got Medicare, Social Security, education, welfare, and all the other government spending, social programs, etc. All these businesses and people deposit currency into their bank accounts. So the military, Medicare, all these businesses are depositing now into their bank accounts from the money that was passed over from the Treasury to the government, from the government to these programs, and then from these programs into the banks. Fractional reserve banking. Okay. So you deposit $100 into your bank. Right? So this is you depositing money in. So, okay. You deposit $100 into your bank. The bank holds 10%, $10, and loans out 90%. $90. So this is how banking works. Okay, so the $90 that was given here, that was loaned out to somebody else, so that person has $90 and they deposit it into their bank. Okay? And now they do the same thing. They hold 10%, $9, and they loan out 90%. So 90% of $90 is now $81, right? So now that person who deposited in, their money, 90% of it gets loaned to this person who now has $81. And they put that into their bank. And the bank holds 10%, $8.10, and loans out 90%, which is now $72.90, and they loan it to this next person. And then the whole process repeats over and over again. So the original $100 turns into $1,000 after it has been loaned again and again. So you originally start out with $100, and then you have all of this, which was created out of thin air, right? Just by this simple process of fractional reserve banking, where banks are legally allowed to loan out, depending on what the laws are, around 90% of your money. So they only need to hold about 10%. So you put your money in, they loan out 90% of it. They put their money in, they loan out 90% of that. They put their money in, they loan out 90% of that. And it just keeps going on and on and on again until eventually it's been loaned out to where this is what the end result is. So from the original $100, it turns into $1,000. Tax plus interest. Okay, recap. Okay, so currency is loaned to the Treasury straight out of thin air by the Fed, right? So this is that original currency creation process. Currency is loaned to the Treasury straight out of thin air by the Fed. Then the government spends the currency on all its different programs, and people who receive this currency deposit it into their banks, right? So this is that second government spending part. And then once the currency is in banks, it is multiplied through the magic of fractional reserve banking. So these people are putting their money into the banks, and they keep loaning it out, putting it back in, loaning it out, that kind of thing. And all this new currency that has been created out of nothing and through loans, right? So this is all this currency that's been created, as you can see here. All of this currency that's created out of nothing and through loans gets taxed by the IRS. So now all this currency goes to the IRS, who then hands it over to the Treasury. So they hand it to the Treasury. So the Treasury can pay the principal plus the interest on its bonds, right? So Treasury owes on their bonds. Yes, the same bonds the Fed originally bought with currency, they loaned into existence. So here we go now. The Fed's getting this, right? They have interest on their bonds, principal plus interest. And there's still one final trick. Every dollar that has been loaned into existence, so these are all the dollars now that have been collected, they have interest attached to them, right? So every dollar that has been loaned into existence has interest attached to it. Okay, so these all have interest also. And the interest can only be paid back with more dollars. And more dollars can only be loaned into existence. So we have no option but to inflate the dollar. Cut all the taxes you want. Cut back spending all you want. It doesn't matter. Inflation is mathematically inevitable. Thanks, Fed. So that is the whole process of currency creation. So currency creation to government spending, and it comes over to fractional reserve banking, and then we have the whole taxes part where the IRS, and then getting it to the Fed, principal plus interest, and then the interest on each note. And yeah, thanks guys. So you have the Fed to thank for that. Okay. Quote, although listed as part of the Treasury Department, the IRS is actually a private collection agency for the Federal Reserve. As you can see here, the IRS is a collection agency right here. Boom, 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 right? So it goes from IRS, Treasury, Fed. Anyway, okay. The IRS is actually a private collection agency for the Federal Reserve System. It originated as the Black Hand in medieval Italy, collectors of debt by force and extortion for the ruling Italian mob families. All personal income taxes collected by the IRS are required by law to be deposited in the nearest Federal Reserve Bank under Section 15 of the Federal Reserve Act. The money held in the general fund of the Treasury may be deposited in Federal Reserve banks, which banks, when required by the Secretary of the Treasury, shall act as fiscal agents of the United States. End quote. Eustace Mullen's Secrets of the Federal Reserve. So, to put it bluntly, Ponzi scheme. The Federal Reserve is a giant Ponzi scheme of the greatest magnitude. The only way to pay off current dollars in existence is to borrow even more dollars into existence. Imaginary money. All of the money we use today is imaginary money that isn't backed by anything. The only value our money has is the value we give it. Fifth plank of Communist Manifesto. A central bank controlled by the state is the same setup they had over in the Soviet Union and is the fifth plank of the Communist Manifesto. Robbery. The Federal Reserve is white-collar robbery at the highest level. Talk about money laundering and illegal counterfeiting. $400 billion a year in interest. Over $400 billion of taxpayer dollars, roughly 20% of all income taxes, go to pay only interest to the Fed. If we didn't have the Fed, we wouldn't have these interest payments. Poverty. The largest creator of poverty in America is the Federal Reserve. Our money is worth almost 100 times less since the creation of the Federal Reserve. Not about money, about control. The Fed has never been about making money. The people who own the Fed have all the money they could ever need. It is about control, and they control us through money. The chairman more powerful than president. The Fed chairman is much more powerful than the president of the U.S. The president may be the chief executive, but the Fed chairman controls whether or not America is rich or poor without any oversight. Largest scam facing America. In short, the Fed is the largest scam facing America. A look into the history and the current operations of the Fed will reveal the true intent and the true degree of treason such an edifice holds. Quote, if all the bank loans were paid, no one could have a bank deposit, and there would not be a dollar or coin or currency in circulation. That is a staggering thought. We are completely dependent on the commercial banks. Someone has to borrow every dollar we have in circulation, cash or credit. If the banks create ample synthetic money, we are prosperous. If not, we starve. We are absolutely without a permanent money system. When one gets a complete grasp of the picture, the tragic absurdity of our hopeless situation is almost incredible. But there it is. End quote. Irving Fisher. How do we fix it? So with all this bad news about the Fed, can anything be done to fix it? Of course. The best solution is to allow people to use whatever currency they want to use. Right now we are forced by law to use Federal Reserve notes. If we allowed people to transact in whatever currency they wanted to use, we would see an advancement in the overall quality of life that has never been seen before. The money we use every day is the main reason why we have so many problems. Solving the problem of money will make every other political issue pale in comparison. But the free market approach probably isn't going to happen for a number of reasons. So we're left with the next best option. Get rid of the Fed and let the Treasury issue its own currency interest-free. Right now we are paying interest on our dollars to international bankers like the Rothschild simply because we choose to. At any time, we could say no more and issue our own money without interest through the Treasury. Before we go out and do something like this, it may be worthwhile to remember American history. As we pointed out, having the Treasury issue its own currency without central bank involvement has been done before with bad results. Lincoln tried it with greenbacks and was killed. Kennedy also tried it, and he was also killed. The international bankers don't mess around when it comes to money. The history of America has always been about keeping international bankers from turning America into a feudal nation of serfs. And right now, the bankers are winning big time. Now, the bankers may be able to stop a few people here and there, but they can't stop all of us. Their greatest fear is the people waking up and figuring out how the banking system works. If we know how their game works, they're finished, and they can't stop us. And this is what they fear more than anything. The international bankers rely on our stupidity to even have a fraction of control over us. As soon as we figure out how their game of banker slavery works, it's game over for them and we can finally move forward to the next step of civilization. Henry Ford said it best. Quote, "It is well enough that people of the nation do not understand our banking and monetary system, for if they did, I believe there would be a revolution before tomorrow morning." End quote. Henry Ford. And now you know. So, share this. This guide took a lot of time and hard work. If you found value in it, please spread the word with your friends and help expose the counterfeiting fraud that is the Federal Reserve. So please share it on Facebook, Twitter, Google, wherever. You can link directly to this. It's actually a web page, as you can see here. It is truthcontrol.com/federal-reserve-guide, Federal Reserve Guide. You can go directly here and you will see this exact page that I'm showing you, and you can kind of click around and view it and see what you need to see. Or you can just link to this video that's on YouTube and just listen there and share that. So with that said, thank you very much for listening. I hope you learned something. I hope this video was beneficial to you. And yeah, thank you very much and have a great day.